the late 13th century, a Venetian merchant named Marco Polo arrived at the court of the most powerful ruler on earth, Kublai Khan, and saw something that genuinely stunned him. People were buying and selling goods, paying rent, settling debts, all using small rectangular pieces of paper. Not gold, not silver. Paper, stamped with the seal of the Khan. When Marco Polo returned home and described this to other Europeans, many of them assumed he was exaggerating or simply lying. A society running entirely on paper seemed as implausible as a society running on nothing at all. But China hadn't stumbled into this by accident. It had taken nearly 5 centuries to get there through a series of very practical problems, each one solved just well enough to create the next one. To understand why paper money emerged in China before almost anywhere else, you have to start with a problem that had nothing to do with trust and everything to do with weight. Standard Chinese currency for centuries was the copper cash coin, a small, round coin with a square hole in the centre, strung together in sets of 1,000 along a cord. A single string of 1,000 cash was already an awkward, heavy bundle. But in the region of Sichuan, copper itself was scarce, so local authorities minted coins from iron instead. Iron is far less valuable than copper for the same weight, which meant Sichuan's iron coins were worth only a small fraction of a standard copper coin. To buy something genuinely expensive, like a bolt of silk or a cart of grain, a merchant might need to carry an amount of iron coinage heavy enough to require an actual cart, or several strong porters, just to complete one transaction. Records from the period describe merchants needing as much as 10 times the weight in iron coinage to match the purchasing power of an equivalent sum in standard copper cash, meaning an everyday transaction that a single string of copper coins could settle required something closer to a small mountain of iron in Sichuan. Trade didn't stop, because trade rarely stops entirely, but it slowed to the pace of the heaviest object in the room. Something had to give, and it wasn't going to be the value of the metal itself. The first crack in the system actually appeared earlier, under the Tang dynasty, and it had nothing to do with paper replacing coins directly. Long-distance merchants, particularly those trading tea and salt between the capital Chang'an and the southern provinces, grew tired of physically transporting heavy strings of copper cash across hundreds of miles of road, through territory that wasn't always safe. So provincial offices and wealthy merchant houses developed a workaround. A merchant would deposit their coins with a trusted office in one city and receive a certificate split into 2 matching halves for verification, authorizing them to withdraw the equivalent amount in another city, far away. The system even carried an official name, convenient money, reflecting exactly what problem it was solving. Historians later nicknamed these certificates flying cash, because the money itself never had to travel, only the paper representing a claim to it did. It wasn't yet currency in the way we'd recognize it today. You couldn't hand your flying cash to a stranger to buy dinner at a roadside inn. But it planted an idea that refused to go away, that a piece of paper, under the right conditions, could stand in for a physical pile of metal sitting somewhere else entirely. That idea fully matured in Sichuan, the very province struggling under the weight of its iron coins. Sometime around the early 11th century, A group of wealthy merchants in the city of Chengdu, a wealthy hub of the silk trade, began issuing their own paper receipts called jiaozi in exchange for deposited coinage at what were essentially the era's first deposit shops. A merchant could hand over a genuinely inconvenient pile of iron coins and walk away with a lightweight paper note instead, redeemable later for a small handling fee, typically around 3% of the deposited amount, a price merchants were evidently happy to pay in exchange for never having to haul iron across the province again. What happened next is the important part. These notes didn't just sit in a drawer waiting to be redeemed. People started trading them directly to each other, the way you'd hand over cash today, without ever going back to redeem the original coins. The paper itself had become the transaction. The private merchants issuing jiaozi had, without fully intending to, invented a working paper currency, backed by their own reputation rather than the state's. It worked beautifully, for a while, until a predictable problem emerged. Counterfeit jiaozi began circulating, and some issuing merchant houses simply didn't hold enough coin in reserve to honour every note they'd printed. Private currency backed by private reputation is a fragile thing, and it didn't take long for those cracks to show. Some issuing merchants ran into financial trouble of their own, and their jiaozi lost value or became worthless entirely, taking their holders' savings down with them. Lawsuits and public complaints piled up. The Song dynasty government, watching this unfold, drew an obvious conclusion. This idea was too useful to leave in private hands, and too risky to leave unregulated. In the early 1120s, the state stepped in, shut down the private jiaozi system, and established its own official paper currency office, issuing notes under strict rules, fixed circulation limits, reserve requirements in real coin, and validity periods after which old notes had to be exchanged for new ones. For the first time, a government, not a merchant guild, stood behind the value of paper money. It was a much larger, much more centralized version of the same basic promise. Trust this piece of paper because we say it's worth something, and we've put rules in place to make that promise credible. It's tempting to think the story was already finished at this point, but the most radical step was still ahead, and it belonged to the Mongol rulers of the Yuan dynasty, specifically Kublai Khan. Song dynasty paper money, whatever its official backing, still traced its origins to deposited metal coins sitting somewhere in a vault. Kublai Khan wasn't even the first Mongol ruler to experiment with paper currency. Decades earlier, Ogedei Khan had issued notes loosely backed by stores of silk held in the imperial treasury, a kind of halfway step between metal-backed money and pure decree. But it was Kublai who removed the backing almost entirely and made the imperial seal, on its own, sufficient. Kublai Khan's currency, known as Chao, cut that final thread. It wasn't a receipt for metal being held elsewhere. Marco Polo, in his own account, described in detail how these notes were manufactured, from the inner bark of mulberry trees, pulped, pressed into sheets, cut into rectangles of varying sizes for different denominations, and stamped with the vermilion seal of the emperor's own officials. The note wasn't a claim on anything physical at all. It was simply declared to be valuable, by imperial decree, full stop. There was no vault of silver underpinning every note in circulation, only the authority of the great Khan himself. This is the moment the story of paper money finally catches up to the story we told in our very first episode. A Lydian coin's value came from a king's stamp guaranteeing its metal content. Kublai Khan's paper skipped the metal entirely and kept only the guarantee. A currency backed by nothing but authority only works if that authority is absolute, and Kublai Khan made sure everyone understood the terms. According to Marco Polo's own account, refusing to accept the Khan's paper money as payment was punishable by death. Read that again, because it's worth sitting with. The single biggest obstacle to any new currency is convincing people to actually treat it as money. And the yuan's solution to that obstacle wasn't clever marketing or gradual trust building. It was a capital offence to say no. Old, worn notes could be exchanged for crisp, new ones at government offices for a small fee, and foreign merchants arriving in China with gold, silver, precious stones or pearls were required to sell them to the state at an official price and accept payment in local paper currency before doing any further business. Marco Polo wrote that merchants accepted this paper as readily as if it were pure gold, because the great Khan's authority and credit were, in practice, absolute. For several decades, remarkably, the system actually worked. There was also a quieter mechanism keeping it honest. Taxes throughout the empire were collected in that very same paper currency, which meant the state had an ongoing, practical need to keep pulling its own notes back out of circulation, not just pushing new ones in. Trade flourished across an empire stretching from the Pacific to the edge of Europe. Marco Polo wasn't lying. He'd simply witnessed something Europe hadn't invented yet. Every promise backed by pure authority carries the same temptation, and eventually the yuan government gave in to it. If the state can declare a piece of paper valuable simply by saying so, what's stopping the state from printing more of it whenever it needs money? Nothing, structurally, is stopping that, and the yuan state needed money often. Costly, failed naval invasions of Japan, expensive military campaigns in Southeast Asia, ambitious infrastructure projects, and an increasingly bloated imperial administration all demanded funding, and printing new notes was simply easier than raising it through taxation alone. As the decades wore on, the printing presses ran faster than the economy underneath them could support. Each new wave of notes diluted the value of the ones already in circulation. This is the same fragility we saw hinted at in Lydia's early electrum coins, but at a civilizational scale. When trust is the entire foundation of a currency and nothing else stands behind it, that trust becomes the single point of failure for everything built on top of it. By the middle of the 14th century, the consequences were impossible to hide. Prices for ordinary goods climbed sharply as the paper currency lost real purchasing power, a classic inflationary spiral, and the yuan government's notes became less something people wanted to hold and more something people wanted to spend immediately, before they lost further value the following week. This wasn't the only pressure the Yuan dynasty faced. Famine, plague, and the widespread Red Turban Rebellion all played their part in the dynasty's decline, but the collapsing credibility of its currency was woven through all of it, undermining the government's ability to tax, to pay soldiers, and to function at all. A government that had once executed people for refusing its paper money now found people avoiding that paper money by nearly any means available, reverting quietly to barter, to silk, to whatever held value more reliably. The Yuan court tried more than once to reset the system, issuing entirely new series of notes at various points in hopes of restoring confidence. But each reset only worked for a short while, because the underlying problem, printing more currency than the economy could support, was never actually addressed. Trust, once broken this thoroughly, doesn't rebuild itself just because the paper gets a new design. By 1368, the Yuan dynasty had fallen, and the paper currency system that had once organized the largest contiguous land empire in history fell with it. Or close enough. You might expect the dynasty that replaced the Yuan to have learned the obvious lesson and abandoned paper money altogether. Instead, the early Ming dynasty tried again, issuing its own notes, known as the Da Ming Bao Chao, beginning in the 1370s, elaborately printed in blue-black ink with images of coin strings indicating each note's face value and bearing a stern warning that counterfeiters would be executed. And with a kind of grim historical rhyme, the Ming government made almost the identical mistake its predecessors had. The notes had no fixed mechanism forcing old currency out of circulation as new currency entered. Unlike the Song system's expiration cycles, there was no meaningful convertibility back into silver or copper, and issuance continued well past the point the economy could absorb. The state even tried forcing acceptance by requiring certain taxes and fines to be paid partly in paper notes. But merchants simply built the notes' falling value into their prices, openly discounting it and preferring payment in silver whenever they could get it. Around the same period, vast quantities of new silver began arriving in China through trade routes connected to Spanish colonial mines in the Americas, giving merchants a real, tangible alternative to a currency they no longer trusted. Within a few generations, Ming paper currency had become so devalued it was barely used at all. By the mid-Ming period, China had quietly abandoned its own invention. The country that had pioneered paper money would spend the following centuries running primarily on silver instead. Paper money's next major chapter wouldn't happen in China at all. It would happen nearly 300 years later in Sweden, a country with the opposite metal problem. Sweden happened to be, at the time, one of Europe's largest copper producers, thanks largely to the enormous Falun mine. That abundance was excellent for Swedish exports, but it was terrible for domestic currency, since flooding your own money supply with an increasingly common metal is a reliable way to make that metal, and the coins struck from it, worth less and less relative to everything else. Sweden's coins had swung to the other extreme entirely. Sweden's largest denomination copperplate coins weighed close to 20 kilograms apiece, a single coin heavy enough that it genuinely required 2 hands, or a small cart, to carry any meaningful sum. In 1661, a banker named Johann Palmstruch, running an institution called Stockholm's Banco, issued what's widely considered Europe's first paper banknotes, credit notes redeemable for the copper sitting in the bank's own vaults. For a moment, it looked like a clean, elegant solution to an old, genuinely absurd problem. And for the first few years, it was. Merchants embraced the lightweight notes eagerly, trade sped up, and Palmstruch's bank grew rapidly on the strength of its own success. Then, Palmstruch's bank did something achingly familiar. Encouraged by that early popularity, it began issuing notes to fund loans without holding matching copper in reserve for all of them, quietly loosening the very promise the notes were supposed to represent. Confidence collapsed within just a few years, once depositors realized the vaults couldn't possibly cover every note in circulation. The bank failed, and Palmstruch himself was later convicted and imprisoned over the affair, though eventually pardoned. Sweden's central bank, the Riksbank, founded not long after in 1668 and often credited as the oldest central bank still operating anywhere in the world, existed in part to make sure that particular mistake wasn't repeated quite so carelessly again, and for a long stretch of its early history it ran remarkably conservatively, precisely because of how Palmstruch's experiment had ended. Look at the shape of this story, and a pattern becomes hard to miss. Two civilizations, separated by centuries and thousands of miles, arrived at the same idea through nearly identical pressure. Metal that had become too heavy, too scarce, or too impractical to keep using. Both discovered that paper could solve the weight problem beautifully. And both discovered the hard way that a promise is only as strong as the discipline behind it. Paper money didn't succeed because paper is magic. It succeeded when it succeeded, because someone, a merchant guild, an emperor, a national bank, was willing to treat the promise as sacred rather than convenient. And it failed every time the moment that discipline slipped. That tension between a promise that's convenient to make and a promise that's disciplined enough to keep never really went away. It just changed shape, moving from mulberry bark to copper-backed notes to whatever sits in your banking app today. Here's the part worth sitting with, though. For most of the 20th century, the world's major currencies still kept at least a thin thread back to gold. The same instinct that made Song dynasty jiaozi feel safer than Kublai Khan's chow. That thread was finally cut in 1971, when the United States ended the dollar's convertibility into gold entirely. Every major currency on Earth today runs on exactly the same principle Kublai Khan declared by decree 7 centuries ago. Valuable because an authority says so, and because enough people agree to keep believing it. We didn't leave his experiment behind. We simply made it global. Every banknote that's ever passed through your hands, every number sitting in a banking app today, descends from this same lineage of trial, collapse, and reinvention. Every instrument has a story. This was the second one.